You know, I like this town of Neath. It's an astonishing place with an incredible history. The Romans were here, and of course the Normans were here building their castle, just a few yards outside. And this church, St. Thomas's Church, was actually the garrison church. But what is so wonderful about it, from my point of view, is this terrific window just here, because it's dedicated to the Showman's Guild. This town is full of interesting buildings, like this one, for instance, which houses the archives of the Neath Antiquarian Society. It was a building, as the plaque says, that was designed by Alfred Russel Wallace, who collaborated with Darwin. So this town is full of interesting people from history, but there's one in particular that I'd like to find out a little more about today, and that's Miss Elizabeth Davies. So with all the fascinating and interesting people and fascinating and interesting places here in this town of Neath throughout its long history, why Elizabeth Davies? Well, she interests me because she's quite an unusual character, the little that we know about her. She kept a lollipop shop here in Wynn Street, or Wine Street in Neath, in the early years of the 19th century. But what makes her stand out in my mind is that she wrote a 19-verse poem celebrating the opening of the Tennant, or as it was then known, the Neath Junction Canal. But what I think is really remarkable about her is that she was a first language Welsh speaker, and yet she was writing in English. Pretty incredible thing to do at that time. Elizabeth Davies's poem, its title is Lines on the Neath Junction Canal, but it's actually about the Tennant Canal, which is just here on my right-hand side, and then over on my left is the Neath Canal. And the reason it was then called the Neath Junction Canal, because just under the bridge behind me, that's where the two canals met. George Tennant must have been something of a character in building this quite amazing canal, which he finally opened in 1825 after having to overcome a lot of opposition. But the impact it had was quite substantial, because after all, it opened up the whole of the Neath Valley to the expanding port of Swansea. Elizabeth Davies put pen to paper and celebrated the event. Today, I'm going to seek out some of those places in and around Neath that she mentions. So let's begin here at Aberdillis with the opening verse of her wonderful epic poem. Oh, could I make verses with humour and wit, George Tennant Esquire's great genius to fit. From morn until evening I would sit down and tell and sing in the praise of Neath Junction Canal. You know, her poem is almost like a travelogue, because she mentions so many of the wonderful places along the route of the Tennant Canal, like this terrific, marvellous Cistercian abbey. It is known that this ancient fabric has borne 750 of hard winter's storm. Yet the pillars and arches look wonderful well. It stands by the side of Neath Junction Canal. This place, the National Trust property at Aberdillis, is the industrial history of Wales in microcosm. A copper smelting works was established here in 1558, and then later it became an iron forge, then a corn mill, and lastly a tin plate works. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the waterfall was one of the main attractions for visitors and artists to the beautiful Vale of Neath, and no less a luminary than Turner painted a masterly view of the site. The large rocks in front of the falls, shown so clearly in Turner's painting, were blown up to provide building stone for the aqueduct, an act that was later described as vandalism and had destroyed the cascade at Aberdillis. Miss Davies, however, took an entirely different view. She celebrated the fact that the stones had been used for the construction of the aqueduct. The stones that are in it are the best of all. They come from the rock of Dillice Waterfall. These stones of all others in strength do excel, to bear up the waters of Neath Junction Canal. The aqueduct spans Avon Neath at Aberdillice, just below its confluence with Avon Dillice. And Miss Elizabeth Davies couldn't let such a location pass by, because she wrote, "Where two crystal rivers in union do meet, the skill of the builder must be very great, all for to contend with torrents that swell by building the arches of Neath Junction Canal." Besides having to overcome local and political opposition to the construction of the canal, the actual physical construction of this wonderful inland waterway was something of a challenge for George Tennant and for his engineer, William Kirkhouse. And look at this wonderful piece of engineering just behind me, the aqueduct at Aberdillice. The work, it is finished, and now is complete, without e'er a man with an accident meet. Though there was great danger, yet nobody fell by the building of the aqueduct of Neath Junction Canal. Well, to say that Elizabeth Davies was fulsome in her praise of George Tennant is something of an understatement. He's buried here in this lovely church, St. Cadoc's in Cadoxton. And the last two verses of the poem, indeed, all of the verses of the poem, speak volumes about the social hierarchy of the early 19th century. He, a rich, powerful industrialist; she, a humble lollipop shop keeper. My song, 'tis ended, and now I will rest. I hope Squire Tennant will ever be blessed. His goodness to the poor no tongue can tell, and his courage in making Neath Junction Canal. I hope when he's dead and laid low in his grave, his soul will in heaven be eternally saved, and it will be recorded for the ages to tell who was the grand founder of Neath Junction Canal. So, that was the end of George Tennant. But our story doesn't end there. Whatever happened to Miss Elizabeth Davies? She ended up dying in Neath Workhouse on the 27th of April 1857 at 88 years of age. We don't know that much about Miss Davies, and rather unkindly, some of her writings were described as Miss Davies's doggerel. But she was also known as the singer of the hedgerows, and that's how I like to remember her. And I was very pleased to learn that her writings have actually been preserved in the British Library, a suitable repository for the Unsung Songstress. Well, as by now you've probably guessed that I have a very soft spot for Miss Elizabeth Davies. What a wonderful person she was. She sang the praises of notable people, notable events, various places in and around Neath. But how many people have actually sung her praises? Well, here's a little verse that we put together to celebrate Miss Elizabeth Davies. So, we have tried with all humour and wit a film to Elizabeth Davies to fit. This celebration of our eagerness to tell of the unsung songstress of Neath Junction Canal.